There are some players that you need to know about who are quickly rising up the fantasy football rankings. These are guys that you want on your team one way or another. Some of them are still available on your waiver wire and others you can trade for. So here are those players who are skyrocketing up the rankings for this week and the rest of the year. And we'll start with Cam Akers, the Vikings running back whose usage significantly increased in week 7 against the 49ers. All right, so check this out. Cam Akers played 39% of the snaps, by far his most as a Viking, as you can see in the 3 games this year. But right here is the big one. 48% of the rush attempts, basically 50% of the rush attempts, meaning this was a split backfield. And it was a split backfield where Cam Akers saw 2 more carries than Alexander Mattison. And now this isn't shocking because Mattison hasn't been efficient this season. He's averaging just 3.9 yards per carry, which ranks outside the top 50 backs in the NFL. Now, I will admit that it was a little bit odd, if any game for Mattison to lose usage, that it was this game, because he was averaging about 5 yards per carry in a tough matchup against San Francisco. But Cam Akers did make a couple of big plays in the passing game and was solid in pass protection. Maybe that's why he just stayed on the field a little bit more, a couple more physicality, a couple more explosive plays, 2 catches for 30 yards in this game. Now, no matter how he got there, we still saw this split backfield develop in week 7. And this is terrible news for Alexander Mattison, who ranks 5th this year in opportunity share. He's earning 79% of the Vikings running back targets and carries, but now he's going to start to lose work. And again, he's not an efficient back, so he needs all of these touches to get you there. So this is bad news for Mattison, and this doesn't make Akers a slam dunk fantasy option, but he's trending in the right direction after a 61-yard performance. And by the way, the Vikings have yet to score a rushing touchdown this year. All 16 touchdowns are through the air. That could balance out and work in favor of Cam Akers. Now, the next man up is Deontay Johnson, who returned in week 7. And I mean, this guy was just vintage Deontay Johnson, rinse and repeat. Because in his return, he ran 86% of the routes, which potentially will only go up in future weeks closer to 100%. And he earned 26% of the targets. This is just what this guy does. He goes out there and he earns nearly 30% of the targets week in and week out. Now, this translated to a fine day for Johnson. 13 fantasy points on 6 targets, goes for 79 receiving yards, well above average. And now here's the deal. Deontay appears to be fully over this ankle injury, and it was encouraging to see Kenny Pickett play well in week 7. I mean, check this out. Pickett completes 68% of his passes, 17 of 25. He throws for 230 yards. Now, that yardage might seem low, but he only threw 25 times in this game, a season low. In future weeks, you can expect him to throw 35 to 40 times, which is when you'll start to see Deontay earn those 10-plus target games. Look, week 7 was potentially the worst-case scenario for Deontay Johnson. Pickett only throws 25 times. Pickens goes for a 32% target share in a massive game, and you still get a quality performance out of Deontay. He's a consistent option, and he's going to hit those upside weeks when they throw more and he finds the end zone. And look at his upcoming schedule. It's fantastic. Matchups against the Titans, Packers, and Jaguars, all bottom half of the league's secondaries. And even more exciting is the reason you really want to trade for him is his fantasy playoff schedule. A matchup against the Colts bottom 5 secondary, Bengals bottom 10 secondary, and the Seahawks bottom 5 secondary for your championship game. That is a fantastic stretch for the fantasy playoffs. So I'm trying to trade for Deontay Johnson right now. I've actually sent some trade offers as of today. Now, the next man I want to talk about is a tight end in Deontay Johnson's division, a division rival from the Browns, David Njoku, who saw season high usage in week 7. Njoku went out there and ran 85% of the routes and saw a season high 24% of the targets. Now, this translated to a very solid 9 target performance. And on those 9 targets, he puts up 5 catches for 55 yards, a good day, but it was almost a fantastic day. He just had a touchdown slapped out of his hands by a defender last second in this game. So he now has 7 or more targets in 2 out of his last 3 games. And look, you took this guy in the middle rounds of your draft, maybe a little bit later on, and you were hoping that he could be a breakout tight end for you. And so far, this just hasn't been the case because his quarterback situation hasn't been stable. Deshaun Watson has been banged up and not even able to practice with the first team offense. So what you've been getting is very inconsistent play. I mean, these are the fantasy finishes for David Njoku this year. The first 4 weeks of the season, he barely cracked the top 24, but now you're seeing 2 out of the last 3 games, he has 10 fantasy points and he's finished as a top 12 tight end, and it's only a matter of time until the touchdowns start coming through on this type of volume. But the most appealing part about David Njoku, outside of his increased targets that he's been seeing, is his schedule. He's going to be facing the Seahawks and Cardinals, bottom 10 secondaries, the next few weeks, but that's not all. Because as he approaches the fantasy playoffs, and in the fantasy playoffs, it gets even better. Towards the back half of the season, he'll have matchups against the Broncos, Rams, Jaguars, and Bears secondary, all bottom 10 in the NFL, so that's great. And then you get into the fantasy playoffs, and it starts off with a matchup against the Texans, a fantastic matchup. So Njoku is rising up the rankings for all these reasons, and if Deshaun Watson can come back and start to play well, it'll look even better for him. Now we're going to talk about a player who's available in over 95% of fantasy leagues, and if you're finding this helpful, 67% of people who watch my videos aren't subscribed. Most people just don't know it. It takes 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button, and it really helps me out, but also will let you see my future content, so hit that subscribe button. Now that player I'm talking about is a 6th round rookie for the New England Patriots, and it's the wide receiver Demario Douglas, who's quickly rising up the Patriots depth chart and the fantasy rankings. Now if you're somebody who pays attention to the preseason and training camp news, Demario Douglas almost every single day was getting hyped up for somebody who was just making big plays in camp. And look, he started his rookie season off for a 6th round pick. Let's keep that context in there. He started off well. 47% of the routes run in week 1, earned 13% of the targets when Devontae Parker was out. And then his solid usage continued. You could see week 3, 40% of the routes, 41% of the routes in week 4. This is with all the players on the team healthy. And then in week 5, he suffers an injury and just 18% of the routes. But he returned in week 7 and saw a season high in usage. With Juju Smith-Schuster out, Douglas was a full-time player, running 74% of the routes, a season high. And this led to a very solid game. He had 6 targets. He had 54 receiving yards. When you throw in a 20-yard carry, he had 5 total touches for 74 yards against a Buffalo defense that, yes, you can win against, but reminder, he's a 6th round rookie. So basically all this guy has done in camp and in the preseason is produce and turn heads. And if you're not familiar, he played his college ball at Liberty, where last season was his best season in 2022, averaging over 9 targets per game, just had nearly 1,000 yards, and also was involved, if you see right here, on special teams in the return game, had over 300 yards there last year. This is a nice indicator of your potential athleticism, your talent, and your explosiveness. And that indicator came true at the NFL Combine. As you can see from the player profile workout metrics, he had well above average speed of 4.44 40 time, and then he had also elite bursts, 96th percentiles, top 4% of all time. Now there's a chance that Douglas loses snaps once Juju returns, but Juju ranks dead last in wide receiver efficiency this year and has already been losing snaps when healthy because of this. Douglas is now a top 150 player in my rest of season rankings, and he's somebody that I want to roster in any 12-team league or deeper. All right, now let's talk about James Cook, who saw some concerning usage the past couple of weeks, but in week 7, he got right back on track with solid game flow and usage. James Cook played 55% of the snaps, which is nothing elite, but he handled 65% of the rush attempts, which was a season high. And because of that, well, we just have to call out that this was an increase in usage, so he's rising up the ranks. But there's more. He also saw the majority of the routes run at the running back position, but Latavius Murray was still involved and was seeing the 2-minute offense snaps. Now, ultimately, Cook had a solid game. He had over 100 yards on 16 touches, found the end zone, and was averaging nearly 6 yards, a little bit over 6 yards per touch in this game, and that's just what this guy does. He's insanely efficient per touch. He ranks 8th in the NFL this year after ranking top 5 in this metric last year in yards per touch with 5.8, but look at him as a receiver. He leads all running backs, averaging 10.9 yards per reception this season. Again, when he gets the ball in his hands, he is very efficient. Now, the most important news that we got in week 7 was that this backfield in Buffalo went from being a 3-headed backfield to just 2 running backs being involved due to the Naji Harris injury. And as you can see from the PFF snap counts right here, in that game, it was James Cook seeing 37 snaps, Latavius Murray 32, and there was a 3rd running back involved in Deontay Johnson, an NFL veteran, but he only saw 1 snap. This was a 2-headed backfield, which is good for the floor and ceiling potential of James Cook if 1 less back is involved. So Cook has to move up the rankings because of these things, but let's be very clear. The fella is still not earning goal line work, and Latavius Murray is very much so involved in the receiving game, 17 routes run, 2 targets, and the 2-minute offense work this past week. So although he's moving up the rankings, I'm personally trying to sell high on James Cook after this game because it hasn't been consistent usage. Now this next player who's rising up the rankings, it's probably pretty dang obvious if you watched him in prime time on Monday Night Football in week 7, Jordan Addison, the rookie receiver for the Minnesota Vikings. But he's actually not moving as far up the rankings as you might think. Let's discuss. He had a great game this past week, and we'll get into that in a second, but he actually saw his usage decrease. He went from running 100% of the routes in week 6 in the first game without Justin Jefferson to then just running 73% of the routes in week 7. And the reason why was a guy named Tristan Jackson. If we scroll here, Tristan Jackson actually got involved and ran 22% of the routes and was rotated in as the 4th wide receiver in this offense. It was KJ Osborne who was treated as the wide receiver 1, never leaving the field, running 96% of the routes, and Brandon Powell rotated in, running over 70% of the routes. Now, despite the quietly worse usage, it didn't matter as Addison saw 10 targets and was the #1 scoring wide receiver on the week, going for 2 touchdowns, had a crazy highlight reel touchdown where he rips the ball out of the defender's hand who was going to intercept it and takes it for a deep touchdown over 120 yards. It was obviously a great day for him in a tough matchup. So Addison has now scored 12 fantasy points and over 30 fantasy points in the 2 games without Justin Jefferson, and Jefferson's expected to miss at least 2 more games and potentially upwards upwards of 4 more games, and there's a very slim chance, but a chance that he could just sit out the rest of the season. So Addison's usage should remain high, but the touchdowns are definitely going to be coming down, especially since the Vikings have 0 rushing touchdowns this year. That's going to balance out with the passing touchdowns. I'm actually perfectly fine to sell high on Jordan Addison after what might be his best game of the season and try and sell him for somebody like David Montgomery, who might be returning as soon as this week and is a top 5 opportunity back so far this season in fantasy when healthy. Now, one thing I'm definitely trying to do if I was you would be to acquire the fantasy blueprint, which thousands of people are currently using to win their matchup this week, make the fantasy playoffs, and take home a championship. Every day of the week, I will be sending you a different type of tool, whether it's for your waiver wire, rest of season rankings, game-by-game matchup notes, or projections and rankings for that specific week. And I even have an additional benefit for you that's pretty dang juicy if I do say so myself. Our partner for the blueprint is Vivid Picks, and when you sign up for the blueprint and you deposit and play $10 on Vivid Picks, you're entered into a raffle to get 2 tickets to any NFL game of your choosing. Now, you can get entered into this raffle and access to the blueprint by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description below. Now, these are the 2 simple steps that you'll follow once you get there to get access to all of this in the blueprint. But here's the deal. It's only $5 for the entire year, and if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I'll just refund that $5. No questions asked. This is 100% risk-free. So to get access to your blueprint today and entered into a chance to win 2 NFL tickets, scan the QR code on the screen or click that link in the description below. Now, the next fella I want to talk about is Naji Harris, because he came out of the bye week looking strong, and more importantly, he just didn't lose his role to Jaylen Warren. Look, right before the bye week, Mike Tomlin was quoting to saying this right here: "Hell yeah, we've got to make some changes. That was an ugly product we put out there today," and he goes on to basically just say there's going to be changes on the offense. Now, when I heard that, my concern was, okay, does this mean that there's going to be more Jaylen Warren, who's been a more efficient running back the past year and a half, than Naji Harris? But it was actually the complete opposite. Naji Harris saw a season high in usage when Jaylen Warren saw a season low in usage. Harris took 17 total touches for 68 yards. He was fine in this game and finds the end zone. Now, look, there was a lot of people down on Naji this preseason, and for good reason. He hasn't been efficient in the NFL, but in his defense, he ran behind a bad offensive line last year with bad play callers last year, and they remained there this year, and he was dealing with a Liz Frank injury for part of the year. Now, despite all of those negatives for Naji last year, Jaylen Warren was still able to be highly successful and a top 10 efficiency running back in basically the same situation that Naji was in a year ago. Now, Harris's inefficiencies from a yards per carry standpoint have continued this year. He's averaging just over 3.5 yards per carry, not great, but in certain areas, he's become more efficient. His yards created per touch, he's taken a huge leap, ranking top 24 in this metric, and he's had the 4th most explosive runs this season of 15 or more yards. Now, here's the major issue for Naji and why his 3.7 yards per carry is not all that great, is he's faced the 3rd most stacked boxes so far this year. So teams are just loading the box against him. The goal would be that that would change now that Deontay Johnson is back and there's multiple pass catching weapons out there with Johnson and Pickens. Now, look, Naji hasn't been great this year. He scored under 7 fantasy points in 4 of 6 games, but we just saw this change the week after the bye week where they prioritized him more. So he's rising up my rankings very quietly after this season high usage heading into week 8. And another fella rising up my rankings is Jonathan Taylor, who is easily a top 30 player and a top 10 running back the rest of the season. Because in week 7, Taylor's usage increased again, and this is what we were told. It's going to ramp up over his first month back. Next week, we should see a full-time role. He plays 49% of the snaps and earns even more touches. Taylor had 21 touches, an elite role for 120 total yards and a touchdown, and the most impressive part, he did this against a very stout Cleveland run defense. And this week, he passed up Zach Moss in the receiving game department. Look at this number right here, 48% of the routes run. That's how many routes he was out there running. It led to more overall passing game usage. 4 targets in this one was better than Zach Moss, and that should only increase as the year goes on. Taylor now has 10 targets the past 2 games where he's seen his role increase with Gardner Minshew. That is going to be sticky as Minshew is more of a pocket quarterback and has shown that he is willing to check the ball down. And Taylor, through his limited 3 games, is basically top 10 in yards per touch, running back efficiency, averaging 5.3 yards per touch. That efficiency should hold pretty sticky around there. He looks healthy this year, and his touches should only remain high around this 20 per game number. That's what we saw from Zach Moss the first month of the season. Now, Taylor does have some tough matchups coming up, but truthfully, after what he just did against Cleveland, I'm really not concerned in any matchup for Jonathan Taylor. He is a matchup-proof running back. Now, the next player I want to talk about is the Kansas City Chiefs running back Isaiah Pacheco, who's been in this video. It seems like maybe it has been true like every single week of the season, and he's easily a top 20 running back the rest of the year. His usage just continues to be good. Pacheco saw 67% of the rush attempts in week 7. Yet again, he's just been great. Now, over the last month of the season, he's playing 59% of the snaps and handling 69% of the rush attempts. This is all very strong and borderline wide receiver or running back 1 numbers. And here's what it's led to during this time. He's averaged 18.3 fantasy points per game the past month and has a touchdown in 4 of his last 5 games. Now, this touchdown production might seem unsustainable, but but Patrick Mahomes' starting running backs average over a touchdown per game in his career, so it's pretty sticky. Now, Pacheco is going to have a nice schedule coming up, a matchup this week against the Broncos, which last time out there, he had a season-high 22 touches and 98 total yards, 16 fantasy points, solid game, and then a game against the Dolphins, which that game might have a 55, 56, 57 point total with a lot of points scored. That's going to help the starting running back in that game. And not only that, but in the fantasy playoffs, he faces the Raiders, Bengals, and Chargers, all bottom 10 run defenses. Somehow, if you can, get Pacheco. And for the third straight week, Alvin Kamara is in this video because he only continues to see elite usage in terms of snaps, touches, and oh yeah, check this out. This is from Rich Rebar's stats that Josh Norris pulled on Twitter. Alvin Kamara has been targeted on 35.8% of his routes run this year. That leads not only all running backs, but only Tyreek Hill has been better over that span. So Kamara is somebody I want to add, and I also want to add Trey McBride, the Cardinals rookie tight end, who's seen his usage increase the last 4 weeks, and now Zach Ertz is on IR. McBride had one of the greatest college seasons of all time in 2021. He averaged over 11 targets per game, 134 targets in 12 games, and over 1,100 receiving yards. I also want to add his quarterback, who should return any week now, but they might wait a couple weeks for an easier matchup. And that would be Kyler Murray, who on this past Sunday morning, Jay Glazer reported that no, the Cardinals don't want to basically tank, and this is what they're saying, of course, but it's nice that they are putting it on record. They don't want to tank, they want to build around Kyler Murray. So Murray is rising up the rankings since, yeah, he's going to play for like half the year, and he averages over 21 points per game. That is a great player to have for your fantasy playoffs. And another solid player to have for your fantasy playoffs is this guy right here, based on my tweet, the rookie wide receiver, Rashee Rice for the Chiefs. This past week ran 65% of the routes, the second most on the team. He faces the Broncos this week, great matchup, and he ranks top 8 in yards per route run this year. All of those are fantastic numbers. He is a top 36 receiver the rest of the season. And a top 12 receiver the rest of the season is Puka Nacua, who I told you last week was a buy low option. I hope you got him, because the window to buy Puka might have just closed after he had a crazy 158-yard game, 12 targets, a bunch of wild catches in this one along the sideline, and now in 3 games with Cooper Kupp back, he is still earning 35% of the targets, which would have led the entire NFL last season. Another player worth pointing out is Jalen Hyatt, the rookie wide receiver for the Giants, who was the wide receiver 2 this past week, playing over 70% of the snaps. He's rising up the rankings after his 75-yard day, where he just missed a 25-yard touchdown, which would have only put him through the roof, and then you would have had no chance at trading for him or adding him off waivers. So these are the players who are rising up the rankings for the rest of the season and before this upcoming week. Now, if you want to see the guys who are actually falling down the rankings, or at least will over these next couple of games, and you should trade them away right now, well, check out this video right here. And do me a favor, make sure you're not one of the 67% of people who's not subscribed to the channel. It takes 2 seconds to check, and 1 second to hit the subscribe button will help me out a ton and let you see more easily my future content.